Hello and welcome. Today I am going to be going over everything about Minor Brittle again. This is something I've made a video about before in the past, but there's still a lot of questions and unknown information in the community about Brittle. So we've come a long way since the first video, and we've had time to kind of test everything out, work out how to deal with Minor Brittle properly and efficiently. So I'm going to kind of share with you everything I know to hopefully help you and your group deal with Minor Brittle. So Minor Brittle is caused by applying frost damage to an enemy and proccing the status effect, the chilled status effect. So if you cause the chilled status effect while wielding an ice staff, then you apply Minor Brittle. So you've got to be holding an ice staff, you've got to be wielding an ice staff, you've also then got to proc the chilled effect, and that leads to the Minor Brittle proc itself. Minor Brittle is an enemy debuff which makes them receive 10% more critical damage. So it's quite a huge debuff that's going to be vital to push DPS in your group and in group content, especially for trials. This is now more than ever commonly becoming a kind of tank's responsibility, mostly an off tank. It's their responsibility to apply Minor Brittle within trial content. To proc chilled and brittle efficiently, the basic setup for applying Minor Brittle requires you to run a double frost staff setup. You then need to use an infused staff with a frost glyph on your back bar along with frost blockade. The reason for this is when you put blockade on the ground, that's going to make your frost glyph proc, and it's going to keep doing that for the whole duration of the blockade. Then on the front bar, you need to be using a charged staff. Now, you do not use a frost glyph on the front bar. One person can only proc one frost glyph at a time. So if you've got two frost glyphs, one on the front and one on the back, one of them will never do anything and it will never be able to be procced because you can't proc two of the same enchant by one person at the same time. So by using infused on the back bar with a frost glyph, this will mean you can maintain essentially a 100% uptime of your frost glyph on the enemy. So as long as your blockade is on the ground 100% of the time, you'll be able to do that. This means you have a maximum possible chilled and brittle uptime by doing this. You'll also want to make sure you are using the Elemental Force Destruction Staff passive. This will increase the chance to apply a status effect. And you can even use the Flawless Ritual blue CP. This is a non-slottable, it's just a passive CP. And that will also increase the chance that you can apply the chilled effect and get Minor Brittle. Once you have all that sorted, you want to stick to your front bar as often as possible. And this is because your charge staff on the front bar is increasing the chance that your frost blockade and frost glyph from the back bar cause the enemy to become chilled and in turn are affected by Minor Brittle. So if we take a little look at this situation now, we've got our frost glyph back bar with our frost staff which is infused, and we've got our blockade there. So when we put down blockade, that instantly procs Brittle at the top just there. We're going to sit on our front bar now to guarantee the proc. And there we go, there's the proc again. And it just keeps procking. It'll just proc as soon as the chilled effect is reached. As long as you keep blockade down on the ground, in a single target situation like this, it's going to proc it no problem. You're going to be able to get more or less 95% plus uptime. Sometimes you might get a little bit higher. And as you can see as well, it can proc at 3 seconds and it can refresh again straight away. It doesn't always tick down to 1 second and refresh. It can refresh at any point. So you just keep reapplying it automatically by putting down your blockade on the ground and by having that charged front bar. Always make sure that it's planned ahead kind of who is in charge of doing Brittle. Because as a tank, most tanks in most situations typically use an infused crusher staff. And this won't be the case when you are doing Brittle. So you need to make sure someone else in your group has taken over with the applying of the infused crusher, and that can be a tank or a healer. It doesn't matter who it is, but there's 4 supports in a group usually. One of the 3 other people can easily do the infused crusher instead of you. In trials, it's quite easy and simple for the off tank to run a double frost setup like this in probably 80% or more of trial situations. Now, when running a double frost staff setup, you need to reduce your block cost as much as possible and use as few stamina skills as possible as well. And if you're using a class such as a DK, a Warden or a Sorcerer, they have skills that you can use which cost magicka or cost nothing and return stamina, meaning you can use a double frost staff setup without needing to use the Tri-Focus passive. The Nightblade and Templar also have stamina return skills, but these actually cost stamina initially. So while you can still do the same as you could with a DK, Warden or Sork, it's not quite as effective because you have got a stamina cost associated with those skills. Necros have no real proper way to return stamina. They have a skill that returns over 1,000 stamina, but it's over a really long duration of time and not worth using. So they don't really have an efficient way to return stamina while blocking. So you would either need to be an experienced tank who knows when it's safe to not block, or you would need to use the Trifocus passive and also cast Balance a lot for sustain while using the Trifocus passive. So Brittle and Chilled can be applied easily by all classes. Or group needs a Templar off tank applying Brittle, then there is nothing at all wrong with that, and it can be done very easily. The Warden, however, is kitted out with the skills to apply Chilled and Brittle, even easier than every other class. So if you have the option to be a Warden to do Brittle, then you should definitely do so, because it will make your life a lot easier. The Warden is also better at applying Brittle if you are doing a 1-bar Brittle setup, and it can be easier from an AoE standpoint as well. So the Wardens have access to a lot of frost damage, especially in the Winter's Embrace skill tree, and we've got the Impaling Shards skill. And you can kind of use either morph of this skill, Gripping Shards or Winter's Revenge. Gripping Shards is better if you're doing 4-man content and want an immobilization, and Winter's Revenge is better for kind of boss fights when you can throw it at the boss in certain positions. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to take, but they both have the overall main part of the skill, which is at the bottom where it says it has a higher chance to apply the Chilled status effect. So because it's frost damage, it's going to cause frost and it's increasing your Chilled status effect, and that is the reason why you would potentially use it. So if you are doing a 1-bar Brittle setup, then you just need to make sure you've got a charge Frost Staff with a Frost Glyph on your back bar with Blockade as well. And in this situation, if we take off our other weapon to simulate the fact that we don't have an Ice Staff on the front bar, you obviously just put down your Blockade, and then you would play on the front bar as you would normally, and then as soon as it's about to end, you go back to your back bar, and by using something like Gripping Shards, that will just help to boost the uptime. So as soon as you switch bar, boom, it'll proc again. As long as you keep those two skills active, you can play on your front bar, and then when you switch to your back bar as it's ending, it will just keep proccing. So it is a way to play with a 1-bar setup, but this is not generally advised. It's not as good as using a double Frost Staff setup, but it is possible if you have no other option. I wouldn't advise using just a 1-bar Brittle setup because you were going to lose quite a bit of uptime when you were on the one-hand and shield. But if you play your setup well and play the majority of combat on your Ice Staff, and then just use your kind of sword and board bar as a buff bar, then you should be able to push over a 50% uptime of Brittle reasonably easily. Another way to improve your Brittle uptime is by using the Asylum Ice Staff. It's definitely not essential to use the Asylum Ice Staff, but you do get a guaranteed proc with 2 casts of Crushing Shock. And you would use Crushing Shock in this situation because it's a cheaper skill, so that would benefit you more as a tank. But if we just take a look quickly now, every second cast of Force Shock will always apply Burning, Concussion and Chilled status effects. You've just got to make sure you're using Crushing Shock, and that will proc Brittle. So this is kind of a guaranteed way to just get that Brittle if you're only able to do a 1-bar setup, or if you've not got everything activated in a proper way. Maybe you're not able to put Blockade on the specific enemy that you want. So maybe when there's a boss fight with ads in it, you might get your Brittle proc on the ad instead of the boss, and then you can kind of switch to your back bar if you've got the Asylum Ice Staff, and then you could just proc it on the boss as a failsafe to kind of guarantee you're going to get the proc. For ad pulls in trials, you may want a source of sort of area of effect Brittle, especially in some kind of trials where there are multiple bosses and things like that. If you're newer in a group for kind of Cloud Rest pluses, for example, you might want to have the off tank use Frozen Watcher so they've got a heavy armor set, and so they can create AoE Brittle, and just so they're able to debuff all enemies at the same time. So they're able to debuff everything within that range, whether it's the mini bosses, the boss, if there's any nearby orbs, if there's creepers nearby, things like that. Everything that's close by can all be debuffed very, very quickly and easily. So Frozen Watcher is an option for doing AoE Brittle. And the way this set works, it summons a blizzard around you while blocking, and it inflicts frost damage every 1 second, and it's a 6 meter radius. And this kind of your Blizzard has a 15% chance of inflicting chilled on enemies. But it feels like it's much higher, especially if you're using a charged one-hander on your front bar. This will make sure that this is ticking over constantly, over and over again. So this is definitely the most reliable way to get AoE Brittle. So if we just have a quick look. So I'm on my front bar with my charged weapon. When we block, every time we block, it's refreshing almost. It doesn't even, the timer doesn't even tick down. It's just a guaranteed proc. It stays at 3 seconds. It's a guaranteed proc of Brittle with absolutely no effort at all other than blocking. Now, this set doesn't require you to perma-block. You can play this in a way where you let the timer run down and then you block when you need to. So it's not as if you've got to permanently block. You just need to activate it by casting a block once every 4 seconds. So that is a very, very easy way to get Brittle within ad pulls and in AoE situations. And like I say, for some trials where you might have an off-tank who's not super experienced and they need a heavy armor set and there isn't really anything else that's worth using, this is still quite good to be able to provide AoE Brittle. Another way to get AoE Brittle is by using the skill Pulsar, and this will do frost damage in the area surrounding your character. So it's not quite as reliable, but if you don't want to waste a 5-piece set, such as Frozen Watcher, to get AoE Brittle, then you could just use this skill instead. And again, you'd want to have a charged staff. It doesn't need to be a Frostglyph this time, you need a charged Frost Staff. And when you cast it, you do kind of get that Brittle proc. And it's not always a guarantee though. As you can see, there's one enemy there that hasn't got it, and that one's running out. So you do have to kind of spam cast to get it to work. However, if you do use your gripping shards as well, if you're a Warden, then you do get a more reliable proc. So just to recap everything that we've talked about, to maintain Minor Brittle efficiently as an off-tank, you can run a double Frost Staff setup. You do need to have a charged weapon on your front bar, and your back bar needs to be an infused Frost Staff with a Frostglyph and with blockade down on the ground as often as possible. You can use the Asylum Ice Staff as a failsafe to activate Brittle instantly with 2 crushing shocks, and you can also use gear sets such as Frozen Watcher. You don't need to use a Frostglyph with Frozen Watcher, but you do want to have a charged staff with Frozen Watcher. You could also use the Pulsar skill for proccing Brittle, but again you would need to use a charged Frost Staff. So that is everything guys about Minor Brittle. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below or on the Tank Club Discord. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.